So if people could put things into the question and answer session on Hoover, we'll switch over to there for the questions. Let's see here. Anyone get upvoted? Yes, we did. Excellent. So our first one is for the writing recorder. It looks like you have a really large model. What data set did you train it? And do you have any idea about potential overfitting?
Oh, we are collect we are collected 24 users, in which the training set consists of 3,952 letter samples from 19 users, and for evaluating the performance of recognition, we asked the remaining 5 volunteers to write the letters to build the test set, and to survive overfitting, we adopt batch normalizations in the network.
And in the end, did you do user-independent recognition?
What?
Is it it was user-independent recognition?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So the discussion here is we can certainly talk about have questions for the individual papers, but also for the field in general. I was, as you see, some of the questions are from me, just because I had questions for each of the papers. But if folks have overall ones as well, we get to get them into the Hoover system so we can ask them. So we actually have a question along those lines. There is lots of related papers, technologies, and applications. How do we determine as a community where the real promises lie for hand risk-based interaction? Where is industry in this space? So I have my opinions on that, but does anybody else want to go first?
So I can maybe stand in for industry. I'm not directly in this space, but have been in the past. At the end of the day, if you're manufacturing hardware, BOM cost, the bill of materials almost wins everything. And so it's really about how can you make this as cheap as possible if you're gonna make this at volume. Like they'll fight over tenths of cents. So that's actually something that's really challenging. I think the other thing is really kind of this user-centered value. What need are you really providing to them? And is there a good enough solution already? So I think that's kind of one of the challenges in terms of pushing this out into the product space.
Can you provide some, before you answer, can you give people a little bit background of why do you know this?
Why do I know this? I've been in Silicon Valley for a while now, a decade plus in corporate research labs, and have worked for several different hardware manufacturers, Intel, Nokia, et cetera. And yeah, this is one of those things. Like, it's amazing my time at Nokia, where yeah, literally they were fighting over tenths of a cent for a $200 phone. And so the level of pressure is extreme, especially when you're pushing out tens of millions or hundreds of millions of these devices.
Following on that, though, I will say that when you're doing a new device, like this supposed to be very different, like a new fitness center or a new smartwatch before these things were commonplace, there's a little bit more price intolerance. But I agree with you that you're trying to get as much out of the system as you can for as least cost. And along with that is the power issue. Right? Which sensors are going to cause your battery to be a bit too big and your BOM cost to increase because your battery is now larger.
Well,
Cheng, you have that
design for manufacturing and all this other stuff too.
Yeah, it's huge. There was another comment.
Stat, I don't think I clearly hear your question. Do you want to rephrase that again?
Sure. The question was, how do we determine as a community where the real promises lie for a hand and wrist-based interaction? Where is industry in this space?
Okay, I'm happy to give an answer on that. I'll give my own perspective on that. So I think I like what Ken said about user-centered design. So one part was, this field have been talking about gestures input for years, but how many of us actually using gesture input in our daily life? The reality is the last time I used that, it was my girlfriend forced me to like do the dance central with her in front of Kinect. That's the last time I do it, and that's probably the only time I'll do it every month. So, and when you think about like user-centered design, what is really needed? Is there something that we design? My own previous research, sometimes we design gesture just for for different purpose, but is there any people really use that? So that's the thing we need to really think hard on. What are the things that people are going to use? That's one. Second part, I actually respectfully disagree with what King said. So I think I understand that part about industry. You think about the devices, cost, the energy consumption. True, I totally agree with that. But that's from industry perspective, right? From researcher itself, for us, we're visioning not for next 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, even 10 years. The devices right now seems like unreasonable. Expensive and energy hungry may not be that bad in the next 5, 10 years. So there's a boundary there when you think about those things. So as a if as a researcher, I think we need to think big and not only limited by those hardware limits. I think that's another part. The third part I would say is in this field, quite often like people think, oh, you're doing gesture input, you're doing that part. Actually, think of this way. The gesture is just part of a body language, or one way human communicate with each other. So we should not isolate this part into the gesture input community. It's in large, recognize the gesture just similar as one part of your human activity. Can we situate this part into a larger context? Yeah, that's my.
I'm going to agree with Chung's disagreement of me. Yeah, so I think one of the opportunities for academia is to go big, right? And so industry is basically risk intolerant, and corporate research in industry is moderately risk tolerant, and in academia you can be hugely risk tolerant. So you can do things that fail, and that's okay. They don't necessarily need to make it into a product. The cost of the failure, even if it's a negative result, you have to worry about publishing it, but otherwise, there really isn't a lot there. So yeah, I would definitely kind of push on the boundaries. One thing I think I would give a caveat on is, what are your technology assumptions about the future? And are those real technology assumptions? Don't assume your battery is going to get 10x bigger. That is, I will laugh if I'm reviewing your paper. Like, that's probably not going to really happen. So what is the technology curve? Some things we don't know, there are discontinuities. Other things we have long track records of. And so as you're thinking about where the technology might go, what's plausible given kind of what we've already known about those technologies?
Okay, I'm going to jump in here with my own opinions. So one thing I require all my students now to answer is Don Norman's objections in his paper called Gesture Interactions, A Step Backwards for Usability. And what Don Norman is saying is that a gesture system is not easily discoverable. There's not a nice mapping of gesture to action. So if you're expecting your consumer, your user, to memorize 10 different gestures to control your device, you're probably doing the wrong thing. For example, with normal iPhone earbuds, iPod earbuds, just the old cable, there's something like 16 different interactions you could do, and nobody knows them. They know like 4. So Don says, look, if you're looking at a gesture interface, you got to make it directly manipulable. You got to make it obvious what to do, and that's why, my teams have gone down the sort of orbit style interfaces where on screen you have cursors following objects, and you match your movement to those objects, because that's discoverable, repeatable, scalable, visible. It answers all of Don's objections to why gesture interfaces are bad. But I think we got to start getting beyond these, take a sensor, apply it to a body part, and do 10 commands. We got to get to a stage where we're looking at things like false positives per hour. Is this an ecologically valid problem, and does it answer Don Norman's objections? Now, I will say that in industry, like at Google, they're always asking about, can we do one-handed wristwatch interactions, right? But because that feels like a desire, yet it's unclear it's actually a real need for the users. So I think we still have a long way to go as actually understanding what people need in everyday life for these interfaces. I have another comment here.
Actually, I have one small question. When Prof. Zhang Chen was talking, because you were mentioning we actually really use the interactions we have developed or we have researched in academia, but also you said we want to look at big. We don't want to just look like 1 day or 1 month or 1 year. Probably we'll look at 5 years. But if we think about this, it's more like 5 years or 10 years. Then it's a very big change. So users might not be like they're used to this kind of big change, like total modality. So then how can we find the balance between you want them to make change? Because in industry, you will see the changes little by little. Then users can smoothly they can go through. But if you change it a lot, like a new modality or totally new technology, how can we let users to use it? So for me, it's more like we are preparing some potential technology in the future, but we cannot use now. I'm not sure about your answer, how to balance these conflicts.
Cool. It seems like a question direct to me, so I'll take it.
Yeah. I mean, I was asking.
Yeah, thanks for your question. I think that's a good question. So because human change pretty slow, right? Human habit change pretty slow. It's hard to change humans. So that's why when we like, especially in gesture design space, when you think about gesture design, that's back to the earlier point I'm making. So we should now make an assumption that a human will change. That's not something we're going to change. We're going to assume when we do research. For example, if we design certain gestures, we expect the user to learn. The reality is no user is willing to learn that, not to mention wear other arbitrary hardware, right? So we should not make that assumption. Then like, how do we do gesture input? And also connecting to set point and Don Norman's paper, right? So gesture, whatever gesture you do, what's a natural way you talk to other people? This is a natural way. Can we make this kind of body language is natural as gesture input in the future to input with your smartphone, with your laptop wearables? Those gestures are just natural. You can customize whatever you feel natural is instead of we design something for them. But actually the user can do whatever they want, and the computers can understand when they want to interact with the device, which device they want to interact, and what content they want to interact with the devices. So, and situate the gesture input into a large context, into like active recognition. This is part of body language. Can we continuously understand humans' intention? Your intention can be what do you want to do, your activity. Do you want to drink, eat, what you're doing, and your interaction with other devices is just part of your body, daily interaction. So I think that's the way I was thinking about it. Now, like design space the same, but instead of what are the natural way we should interact with things, and then design technology around that. Even at this moment, though technology may not be 10 years later, may not be the technology used, but the scenario, the interaction with design may be almost the same.
Oh, cool. Thanks.
I think this leads to a question that was just up here, which is, it went away, which was, specifically for finger gestures, what finger gestures are needed? So I'll start that out. I'll start that off. Turn that on, right? Being able to, and this is what we were just talking about, being able to point to an object and select it for an action that might be verbal or might be gestural is a good one. Another one is text entry, right? I cannot tell you how difficult it was to try to figure out a decent text entry system for glass. If we could actually just write in air, that's actually a decent thing that people already do, and all the gestures already have known meanings, right? If I'm writing, letters like that. Does anybody have other suggestions for finger gestures that are actually needed?
So, I mean, one of the motivations for my work was a very wearable motivation, right? So how do we go about our daily life and actually interact with the real world and be able to sense that without actually getting in the way? And so a lot of our solutions right now are in some way occluding the hands in some annoying way. So they're taking up the palm of the hand, which is the part you really want to use, or they suffer from occlusions or these other things. And so like how do we go about our daily life? And again, this is a very wearables kind of centric motivation. You know, if I'm running down the stairs or working in the kitchen or whatever, how do I provide input there? That's a very different situation than if I'm at my desk or some sort of stationary environment.
Yeah. Especially on the go type stuff, you know, where you don't have the ability to have a stationary surface to go against. Another simple one with that could be finger gestures is the equivalent of a hot word, right? The equivalent of okay glass or talking to Siri or whoever else, having a gesture that indicates that you are now talking to the computer. And that, you know, I think even Don Norman would say is okay because you're just memorizing one thing. Any other finger gestures that seem, we can talk about hand gestures and this sort of stuff, but any other finger gestures seem like important?
I just think about it, an interesting question about like in the Euro, when we're talking, we are like talking directly to people in person. We can like have micro finger gestures we might not have, we might not be conscious about. So how about we using this micro finger gestures, that subconsciousness, to distinguish our emotion or like something like that? Because like something when you are reporting, when you are talking directly to people, people will have some like just some gestures like they are holding their hands or something like that. So I think this is an indication for the emotions, or the like when you are nervous, you are rubbing your fingers more, and when you are more happy to talk about, you open your hands or something like that. I think this is not using the finger gestures to control an object or something, to issue a command, but to find the emotion inside a human body.
McNeil's book called Hand in Mind talks about beat gestures, the fact you do these types of gestures to emphasize points in your speech. And so his thesis was we can use computers to detect that and figure out what's more important in a particular speech. There was another comment somebody was going to make.
Yeah. For me, I mean, for me, it's more like it's actually different area, not area, but it's another usage. It's not like proactive, or you use some, you issue some commands. It's more like at the background there will be sensing going on continuously. It will help you to like more like a context, like sense what's your status or what's your potential aim, to help you to facilitate in the activity you are doing. So it's not like a user is proactively doing an activity or issuing commands, right? As I understand what you said.
Well, I mean, certainly you can imagine for medical monitoring, there's some evidence that, you know, for hyperactivity or for depression, that is shown in the gestures you do. So certainly there's all these monitoring tasks that we could be using a gesture for. Another one my group likes is using gesture to figure out what objects in the environment you're using, right? Getting some more context awareness. You know, are you making toast? Are you making coffee? That sort of thing. Let me go back and see if there's any other questions while I do that. One thing that I've insisted my students do these days is always include a false positives per hour metric. Because if you just run these recognizers all the time, that is a huge potential for them to false positive, as opposed to doing isolated gestures. So if Mike can ask the folks in the session, how do you see being able to do continuous recognition? Do you have some way to isolate things, or do you have good false positives per hour rates? What do you see being the use of your system, and how you get past the false positive per hour problem? And I'll be right back. I'm going to check to see what other questions we got as people take that question.
So I'm going to cheat and say don't. So part of what I was doing is actually, continuously tracking the finger. You can imagine running, gesture rec on top of that, but I really wanted a continuous signal coming out of the fingers for use for whatever purpose. And I think it is one of the challenges of these kind of classification approaches that, yeah, even like with speech rec, right? If we're going to draw an analogy, to use that as a user interface, if it's 1 in 100 that it's times it's breaking, and yeah, if you're doing a classification every few seconds, that breaks a lot.
Well, since I'm not seeing, can you guys see me? Can't nod your head if you can hear me.
I can hear you, but you're black.
Okay. Well, I'll just be black. I normally wear black anyways. So I'm looking for questions from the audience, but one thing that we only have a few minutes here. One thing that I always worry about is artifacts for while you're on the go, while walking, right? And I can imagine for the drone project, for example, that as you're in a nice laboratory environment and you're controlling this thing, but a lot of people want, when they're doing drones in the real world, really want to follow their drones. How can we address the mobility problem with these gesture systems?
Let's see. You mean the mobility of the system, or what? Like portability of the system?
Well, as you walk, it's hard to make the gesture because you're getting mechanical coupling of the shock of your walking with your gesture.
Oh, I see.
Is this question specific to that paper, or is it a general question how to address the mobility issue of the gesture?
General question.
General question.
Okay, so I'll back up to so what I said earlier. I think I don't think the gesture should be isolated from any other part. It's just part of body language. We should continuously understand that part. Then you won't have the issue. Imagine a world if you can continuously know your hand posture on posture from morning to night. Can we actually understand what activity you're doing, even predict what's your next body posture? Because that's a human or creature of habits. So I think that's something I get excited for. At this moment, if you only using for one gesture recognition system to solve the mobility issue, that can be challenging and tough, and always the issue. So, yeah.
Well, for your system, do you have if you try to walk with your system and recover posture, what problems do you have with the infrared cameras? Because the infrared cameras seem to be the best bet. Are there problems with walking and using that system?
Yes, we do have a problem. So problem comes up with the camera position can be shifting, right? Because the wristband is not tight enough. You don't want to be tight enough. The camera position can be shifting. So the image is not consistent. So what happened, we actually have adding a data augmentation. We simulate those noise because those those noise caused by motion can be learned. And we simulate those noise in the training process, and we triple size of the training set by adding a random noise. We use a Gaussian model to model the noise, and that helps us to address that problem. So those noise there's a pattern for those motion noise. So that's how we address that issue. But we do have some issues when you're walking around. And another part of this issue is the background can keep shifting, right? So how can you segment your hand from the background? So that's why our system, we have tried with infrared camera, thermal camera, and RGB cameras. The reason we choose our thermal camera is it's much easier to segment the hand from the background information. compared to RGB cameras. So that's a two significant issue I would say running into. Yeah.
Well, it seems to me with your system that you can, as you're simulating the movement of the cameras around the wrist, but you're kind of stuck in this particular, almost linear transform. So, I can imagine keeping on recalibrating all the time based on the input you have, right? Because there's no way, this camera here is seeing this thumb over here unless it's got rotated.
Right.
So I can imagine a continuous reorientation with your system. That's really interesting that you already did this thing. I saw that in the questions you actually already talked about using synthetic features or synthetic graphics to test it, which I thought was great. For those who don't know, when Microsoft first did the Connect 1, they did, I think about a tenth of the data, the training data was real data of people in front of the camera. But then 90% of it was synthetic data that they synthesized from that real data, and that's how one of the ways they got to good accuracies pretty quickly. A little bit of real and a lot of synthetic to do it. Okay, I think we're out of time. Is that correct? Where's my student volunteers? We were to go to 6:30. Is that correct?
Yeah, we were to go to 6:30.
Okay. Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much to our speakers and for hanging around and asking questions. I have a couple announcements to make before I forget. I was asked by the organizers. Let's see if I can do this correctly. So first of all, in Whova, I believe you can go rate the session for best presentation. Please do so. Remember, your votes count for best presentation at the conference. So the second announcement was to go to GatherTown after the session, and there are special rooms that we are opening up for the audience and authors to actually chat more face-to-face, and some private gathering space. So let me share my screen with you and show you where this is going to be. Hopefully I can get this right. There we go. So in the main foyer, you have service down here, you have the doctoral consortium, all this type of stuff. Go over towards the terrace and the beach and go to the private gatherings area. From there, you see all these different private rooms. You can go to the different tracks. We are going to be track B here, and that's where the authors, I will request the authors to go. So please, authors and everybody want to talk to them, please head over to track B in the private meeting space. And once you get into that private meeting space, authors, if you could stand here, and audience, if you could be over here, that will help us organize folks and be able to meet and walk around and chat with each other. If you haven't tried the GatherTown stuff yet, it's kind of fun. And I have one last announcement. Let's see if I can stop my sharing now. There is the second and third Ask Me Anything meetings, which will be in the landmark room. So if you want to talk to some of the more senior people in the field and just ask them questions about, how to get your paper in, what makes a good demo, what we're doing in the future for the conference, or how to get tenure, how to get a job in this space, or how to get into a PhD program, please head over to the landmark room, and some of the more senior people will be hanging out so you can ask them any question. Thank you all very much for being here. I appreciate your attendance and folks answering questions. Thank you very much for the authors. It's wonderful seeing you all, some old friends and some new people. And hopefully I'll see you around the rest of the conference. Thanks. Student volunteers, is there anything else I missed?
No, you're good.
We're good?
Yes.
Great. I'll make sure I'm doing my job. That's why they pay me the little bucks. All right. Thanks much, folks. See you soon.